Macbeth and Banquo first meet the witches together in Act 1, Scene 3, which is important for the development of both the plot and the characterisation of Macbeth. As a dramatist, Shakespeare was firmly centred on the individual. His main interest was in how the self responds to external and internal forces, and how these interact. In Macbeth, we can identify external forces as being not only the supernatural, such as the prophecies of the witches, but also the way in which Lady Macbeth uses persuasive techniques to transform Macbeth's prevarication into purposeful action. Internal forces can be identified not only as Macbeth's main character flaws, such as his ambition, but also as his unwillingness to accept the uncertainty and ambiguity which pervades the play, and his insatiable desire for knowledge. The supernatural provides the main catalyst points of the plot, in that Shakespeare uses it as a motivation for human action. The witches are there as a means of exploring Macbeth's psyche, his motivations, and his moral dilemmas. Shakespeare therefore uses Banquo as a foil to Macbeth. A foil provides a contrast to the protagonist in order to highlight aspects of their character. Before the arrival of the witches, Macbeth and Banquo are shown to be broadly similar. They are both captains fighting in Duncan's army, and both are described as valiant and fierce in battle. A returning captain says of them to King Duncan, "If I say sooth, I must report they were as cannons overcharged with double cracks, so they doubly redoubled strokes upon the foe." Shakespeare, however, demonstrates that Macbeth seems to have a natural affinity for the witches that Banquo does not, by having him echo their language from Act 1, Scene 1, "Fair is foul and foul is fair," in his very first line, even before he has met them. "So foul and fair a day I have not seen." It is Banquo, however, who is the first to notice them, and from the start exhibits concern and wariness about what they are. What are these, so withered and so wild in their attire, that look not like the inhabitants of the earth, and yet are on it? Notice the use of the interrogative pronoun what here, rather than who, and the way in which he is unable to identify anything seemingly human about them. He goes on to question whether indeed they actually exist. Live you, or are you aught that man may question? He then appears to be almost amused by them when he says, "You should be women, and yet your beards forbid me to interpret that you are so." Notice that Macbeth actually says very little to the witches compared to Banquo in this first scene with them, merely asking to begin with, "Speak if you can. What are you?" This short speech has more than one function. Not only does it verify that they can both see them, and so do in fact exist outside of Banquo's fancy, but the way in which Macbeth finishes this line of verse also indicates that at least at this point in time, they're of the same mind. Banquo approaches the witches with circumspection. He is both wary and sceptical of them from the start. "In the name of truth, are ye fantastical, or that indeed which outwardly ye show?" He asks them whether they only exist in his imagination or if they actually possess the substance that they appear to have on the outside. He does, however, later also ask them to speak then to me, or to tell him what his future will be. Is he merely testing them, or is he curious to find out if he has a glorious future to look forward to as well? This is unclear, although he professes to be disinterested, as he neither begs nor fears their favours nor their hate, both of which Macbeth will go on to do. Macbeth and Banquo's reactions to the witches' sudden departure are also interesting indicators of their attitudes towards them. Banquo muses, "Whither have they vanished?" Macbeth is less concerned about where they have gone. He seems almost dismissive of Banquo's curiosity as he replies, "Into the air, and what seemed corporal melted as breath into the wind." He seems more bothered about the fact that they have gone in the first place. Would they had stayed. He later admits in the letter to his wife that he burned in desire to question them further. Banquo, however, still questions their very existence, wondering if he and Macbeth have inadvertently eaten hemlock. Were such things here as we do speak about? Or have we eaten on the insane root that takes the reason prisoner? Note that Macbeth actually ignores this question, seemingly accepting their existence as a fact. He appears to be far more concerned with the content of the witch's prophecies. He simply responds, "Your children shall be kings." His use of the definite future "shall be" here already suggests his certainty in the truth of the prophecies, and his focus on Banquo's prophecy rather than his own already hints at the rivalry that will spur him on to have Banquo murdered. What Banquo doesn't appear confused about is the fact that the witches are most likely to have evil intentions. When Angus addresses Macbeth as Thane of Cawdor, he first exclaims, "What, can the devil speak true?" But only a few lines later, in his own mind, he has reconciled this seeming paradox. When he and Macbeth are once more alone, he uses the metaphor "instruments of darkness" to describe them. He, like the contemporary audience, believes that they are the conduit through which the devil works. The fact that they may very well be telling the truth with regard to small matters or honest trifles does not necessarily mean that they have good intentions. It may rather, he says, be that small truths can be used to lull you into a false sense of security, to betray us in deepest consequence, or so they can deceive you over something important. Banquo's words are prophetic, as this is exactly what happens as the witches will indeed go on to win Macbeth with honest trifles, i.e. that he is now Thane of both Glamis and Cawdor, and betray him in the very deepest consequence that there is, i.e. spur him on to commit regicide, which will put him on a one-way journey to his own demise. Macbeth's attitude to what he has heard is revealed in his soliloquy, as Banquo momentarily turns to speak to Ross and Angus. He immediately connects the veracity of the first two prophecies with the certitude of the third. Two truths are told as happy prologues to the swelling act of the imperial theme, which kindles his dormant ambition. He is, however, confused, shown in the way his language seesaws from one idea to its opposite. This supernatural soliciting cannot be ill, cannot be good. He appears not to have taken any notice of Banquo's cautious words that reconcile this seeming dichotomy, and his use of rhetorical questions further communicates the quandary he is in. If ill, why hath it given me earnest of success, commencing in a truth? He already seems to be tempted, but at the same time horrified. If good, why do I yield to that suggestion, whose horrid image doth unfix my hair and make my seated heart knock at my ribs against the use of nature? Note the powerful, emotionally charged visual imagery in these lines, which communicates his fear. Even the thought of a murder which has not yet been committed shakes so my single state of man that function is smothered in surmise. He can do nothing without thinking about it. Why does Shakespeare have Banquo ask the witches for a prophecy as well, even though he is wary of them and professes to have no vested interest in what they have to say? One reason is that it again highlights the differences between him and Macbeth. The persuasive power of the witches is such that even Banquo fears sleep and feels the need to pray to God to guard him against the unnatural thoughts which oppress him in his dreams. Merciful powers, restrain in me the cursed thoughts that nature gives way to in repose. He is also honest about the effect the witches have had on him in that he tells Macbeth, "I dreamed last night of the 3 weird sisters. To you they have showed some truth." Macbeth repays Banquo's honesty with a blatant falsehood. "I think not of them," in an attempt to deflect any attention away from his own potential part in any future action that may be connected with them. Even when Banquo admits in a soliloquy at the beginning of Act 3, Scene 1, that he fears Macbeth helped the prophecies along by playing most foully for the crown, he cannot help but wonder privately of the witches, if there comes truth from them, as upon thee, Macbeth, their speeches shine. Why, by the verities on thee made good, may they not be my oracles as well, and set me up in hope? He does, of course, refuse to allow the prophecy to make him act against his moral code, and therefore does nothing to help bring it about. Not only, though, does Banquo's lack of action to further his own cause highlight Macbeth's own inability to resist the temptations that are put before him, but also demonstrates the extent to which Macbeth has embraced the powers of darkness. Another reason, of course, for the witches giving Banquo a prophecy is that it is necessary in terms of the plot. The fact that Banquo's descendants will ascend the throne, even though he shall not be king himself, effectively makes him a rival in the eyes of the ever more paranoid Macbeth, and gives him the motivation to command his murder, which sends him further down the path to tragedy. When Macbeth sees the dagger in Act 2, Scene 1, just before the murder of Duncan, is this another supernatural visitation, or merely an hallucination caused by his overwrought psychological state? This is deliberately ambiguous, but whichever it is, it highlights Macbeth's mental torture, which sees him seesawing between moments of psychological disturbance, where he believes the evidence of his eyes, "I have thee not, and yet I see thee still. I see thee yet in form as palpable as this which now I draw," and "I see thee still, and on thy blade and dudgeon gouts of blood," and moments of lucidity, where he rejects this and rationally comes to the conclusion that his psychological state is playing tricks on his eyes. "Or art thou but a dagger of the mind, a false creation, proceeding from the heat oppressed brain? Mine eyes are made the fools of the other senses, or else worth all the rest." And "There's no such thing, it is the bloody business which informs thus to mine eyes." What this sight does not do, however, is have any influence over Macbeth's decision at this point to murder Duncan, as he confirms that "thou marshallest me the way that I was going, and such an instrument I was to use." In other words, the dagger is merely pointing in the direction that Macbeth was already going, and is merely a representation of the weapon that he had already decided to use. Macbeth's attitude towards the supernatural after the murder of Banquo fluctuates between mortal fear at the manifestation of Banquo's ghost. Once again, is this a supernatural visitation, or merely a product of Macbeth's all-consuming sense of guilt? And total dependency on the witch's prophecies as he becomes ever more isolated and ever more insistent on resolving ambiguity and uncertainty. In Act 3, Scene 4, he is terrorised by the vision of Banquo in his seat at the banquet. "Thou canst not say I did it. Never shake thy gory locks at me." He begs the spectre to change into something real that he might fight as a man. "Take any shape but that, and my firm nerves shall never tremble." Note the hyperbole here, conjuring animals known for their ferocity, which communicates his fear and desperation. Approach thou like the rugged Russian bear, the armed rhinoceros, or the Hyrcan tiger. In Act 4, Scene 1, he seeks out the witches, anxious for reassurance and what he yearns for most, clarity. Things are looking bleak for him as Malcolm is now in England, seeking to raise an army, and he is rightfully fearful that the other Thanes are plotting against him. His state of mind is made clear by the way in which he demonstrates his willingness to risk all the common hazards of witchcraft in order to gain the knowledge he is so desperate for. Though you untie the winds and let them fight against the churches, though the yeasty waves confound and swallow navigation up, though bladed corn be lodged and trees blown down, though castles topple on their warders' heads, though palaces and pyramids do slope their heads to their foundations, though the treasure of nature's germen tumble altogether, even till destruction sicken, answer me to what I ask you. Note Shakespeare's use of anaphora in this speech with the repeated though at the beginning of each clause to communicate Macbeth's determination to hear what the witches have to say. He is comforted by their prophecies, though, which, even though warn him to beware Macduff, declare that none of woman born shall harm Macbeth, and that Macbeth shall never vanquished be until great Birnam wood to high Dunsinane hill shall come against him. He is so relieved at the apparent clarity of these prophecies that he does not seek to question them. That will never be. Who can impress the forest, bid the tree unfix his earthbound root? Sweet bodements, good. The scales finally fall from Macbeth's eyes in Act 5, Scene 5, as to the true meaning of the witches' prophecies. At the news that Birnam wood does indeed appear to be approaching Dunsinane, he angrily, yet reflectively declares that he begins to doubt the equivocation of the fiend that lies like truth. When Macduff confronts him with the fact that he was from his mother's womb untimely ripped, and therefore not one of woman born, he finally rejects them with the certainty he has craved all along when he says, "Be these juggling fiends no more believed that palter with us in double sense," i.e. that trick us with double meanings, that keep the word of promise to our ear and break it to our hope. Or in other words, keep their promises as we hear them to be, but not as we hope them to be. Banquo's warning in Act 1, Scene 3 has surely come back to haunt him. The different attitudes towards the supernatural exhibited by Macbeth and Banquo in the play not only serve dramatic functions, but can also be attributed to the political climate in which it was written. Shakespeare's theatre company, which had formerly been the Lord Chamberlain's Men, under the patronage of Elizabeth I, became in 1603, under James I, the King's Men. This meant that James controlled the purse strings, and Shakespeare's life and livelihood depended upon the plays he put on, being to the King's taste. Macbeth bears all the hallmarks of a play created to flatter the new monarch. It was performed in 1606, not long after the Scottish King James VI ascended the throne as James I. Witchcraft and the supernatural were the hot topics of the time, and the passing of the 1604 Witchcraft Act, along with a previous act passed in 1542, made it a crime punishable by death. James I also had a keen interest in witchcraft and had written a book called Demonology in 1597. Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, after all, and much of the material in the play that Shakespeare uses, relating to witchcraft and the supernatural, is freely lifted from here. Plagiarism wasn't really a big deal at the time Shakespeare was writing, and he is well known for his extensive borrowing of material for the plots of his dramas. Not only did he make use of James's Demonology, but for the actual story of Macbeth, He also chiefly used Raphael Holinshead's Chronicles of England, Scotland and Ireland, first published in 1577, from which he amalgamates two narratives, one relating to Macbeth's murder of King Duncan, and the other to Donald's murder of King Duff. Here, however, he ran into a little problem, as Holinshead describes not a noble Banquo who distrusts the witches and refuses to break his moral code in order to further his own ambitions, but describes instead a scheming Banquo who is Macbeth's accomplice in the murder of Duncan. This would not have sat well with a king who believed himself to be Banquo's direct descendant. Shakespeare's manipulation of history to avoid the king's displeasure therefore further enhances our understanding of how Banquo's attitude to the supernatural is so different from Macbeth's. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments section below and I'll do my best to answer them. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more videos on English language topics and exam techniques and English literature texts.